to the chairman of the World Cocoa Foundation's Board of Directors, Barry Parkin. Barry.
Thank you, Buddy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm Barry Parkin. I'm the CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer, Chief Procurement Officer of Mars Incorporated, and joining you here today as Chairman of the World Cocoa Foundation. And I have the distinct pleasure of getting this critically important session started. We have those speakers. But what I'd like to do is just sort of frame the big picture here as to why this EU initiative, this EU partnership is so important. So let's just start by talking about cocoa. Cocoa is a wonderful crop, a wonderful ingredient. It creates moments of pleasure and enjoyment to billions of people around the world every day. But, and it's a big but, it's also an industry that has significant challenges that we must solve. And let's not shy away from those challenges. They're poverty, child labor, deforestation, all of which are significant and unacceptable to all the participants across the industry. On child labor, there's still millions of children who are either not attending school full-time or involved in hazardous work, and that continues to be unacceptable to all of us. On deforestation, forests are still being cut down. Virgin forests, protected areas are still being challenged by the spread of cocoa and other crops. So a tough time for the industry. But I think there is real hope now. The efforts of the producing country governments, alongside the efforts of industry, are starting to show real progress, real measurable progress. More children are attending school every year, and the incident rate of hazardous work is declining. We know that the initiative from industry of child labour monitoring and remediation does have a significant impact, an impact of perhaps 30 to 50% reduction when it's rolled out to communities. So we have something that's working. And we know also that the rate of deforestation is slowing. It's not stopped by any means, but it is slowing. And that is a result of great efforts from the governments and from industry working together in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. So by working together, we now know that we can drive real change. And that brings me to today's discussion. We do now understand the issues. We've proven that voluntary interventions from industry alongside government can drive change. But again, it's a big but. We've got two issues. We need all the industry to be working on this, not just the leading companies. You know, to put it bluntly, we've got half the industry working on this. We need the other half. We also need a powerful partnership between the demand countries in the EU with the supply countries that grow the crop to accelerate progress together and to identify much needed investments to drive change on the ground for the good of the communities and farmers in these countries. So that's why we're all here together, to work to take this to the next crucial step and to accelerate towards solving these issues. So that brings me to the introductions. I'm delighted to be welcoming and introducing two wonderful leaders on this issue who have become great partners to bringing this issue forward in the EU Parliament Commission. We're shortly going to hear from Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen, the Commissioner of International Partnerships at the European Commission. She has been and continues to be a tireless advocate for the rights of women and girls in international development. And we're delighted that she's working on this issue and joining us by video today. We'll then hear from Ms. Heidi Hautala, Vice President of the European Parliament, and she will then moderate a panel discussion. She's been for the last 10 years working hard on this issue, driving the issue of human rights due diligence to the forefront of the European agenda. And I think her time is now coming. We are getting close to making real progress on this issue. So I'm delighted to thank you both and to welcome you to this session. So let's now move to the keynote address from Commissioner Urpilainen. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, despite these hugely disruptive times, we cannot lose sight of the need for greater sustainability worldwide. There is a growing consensus that cocoa value chain need to be more sustainable. This consensus is essential because producers, consumers, and policymakers together can have a real impact. Supporting a decent price for cocoa farmers over the long term cannot happen without progress on sustainability. This is the logic behind the new Sustainable Cocoa Initiative of the European Commission. Our initiative aims to link higher prices to better working conditions and stronger environmental protection. We launched in September a multi-stakeholder dialogue. This will feed the policy dialogue the EU has with Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. It will also inform the Commission's work on human rights, due diligence, and the Green Deal. The Commission will promote win-win solutions through inclusive dialogue. Dear colleagues, I hope you all enjoy a very fruitful forum. With all the different expertise and background, we can scale our impact despite these challenging times. The pandemic may have disrupted some of our work, but it has also spurred us on to be more ambitious. It has pushed us to develop bolder responses to the shortfalls in our supply chain. I encourage you all to engage and find practical solutions that yield concrete and scalable impact. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And I think we're now moving to the panel discussion. So I'd like to invite Ms. Hautala to open us up on that. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Barry. I'm really delighted that I am in this position to chair and moderate an important panel of the partnership that Commissioner Urpilainen has just explained. And I'm really delighted to see her commitment and that the whole of the EU Commission is now engaged in implementing the EU Green Deal. That it's not just a sectoral initiative, but it's really a cross-cutting approach to EU policymaking. So what we are actually seeing now is that there is a systemic transition starting towards sustainability in the EU. And it's not me, it's other people outside the EU who say that the EU is now in a leading position and can really introduce almost like a global change if it works hard with all partners. And we know that the COVID pandemic has made the work all the more challenging by reversing decades of positive developments in many parts of the world. We should all be very concerned about the rising poverty and hunger in countries where these issues were already to a large part overcome. So what is happening actually in and around the EU? The EU Justice Commissioner, who's also responsible for company law, Didier Reynders, he has announced that there will be a legislative proposal on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence in the second quarter of 2021. And then the EU institutions, the member states on one side and the European Parliament will start to discuss the proposal. But the Parliament has already taken an initiative. We're very busy in the Legal Affairs Committee to propose what kind of legislative proposal this could be. So we want to inspire the European Commission. And I must say that we are really hearing from many different stakeholders and partners that And this idea has to be based on existing frameworks, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises. And I couldn't agree more that we have to build on something that we already have. So the due diligence obligations will extend to the whole supply chain. They will be risk-based, and there will be sufficient flexibility to be built in. So it's not the legislator's task to predefine where the most severe and likely negative impacts on human rights and environment might be. Rather, the challenge is to ensure that we build a preventative mechanism, a mechanism that ensures actions and a positive impact on the ground, and a mechanism which managed to embed the due diligence processes into the company's everyday activities and business strategies. A tick-the-box exercise or a simple reporting requirement is in no one's interest anymore. So also, I would like to ensure that proportionality is a key word leading the legislators in this work. Requirements should be relative to the inherent risks, but also to the size of the company. Same expectations obviously cannot apply to multinational corporations of a huge size and a small company of 50 employees. So this all needs to be discussed. On liability, a law without teeth is not a law, it's not useful, it doesn't serve its purpose. A proper deterrent effect is necessary to create the level playing field that is direly needed. Due diligence obligations extend to the entire value chain. However, liability will likely apply to a much narrower range of entities. It is important to remember that a company is not expected to play the role of a state. Neither is it expected to do more than what can be reasonably expected of it. A company is liable for its own due diligence actions. If it will be able to show it has taken due care, it should not be considered liable. I have mentioned the need to build a preventative mechanism and to ensure a level playing field. In addition, we must not forget the victim's perspective, because it does happen that there will be a human rights harm and there needs to be a way to access a remedy, and that is an enormous challenge. The range of legal and practical barriers is really enormous. Alongside liability, the role of positive incentives is really key. We need to see how a positive weighting of measurable human rights criteria in, for instance, public procurement or access to export credit or trade promotion services might be put in place. We need to look at administrative penalties, such as public listing and or fines for companies that fail to comply with requirements to disclose key elements of their human rights and environmental due diligence efforts. And we need to make sure that there is in place guidance on how businesses should respond to evolving challenges like COVID-19 or sourcing from contexts with a high risk of forced labor, which does happen. Thereby, the crucial element complementing liability is the public disclosure requirements. Moreover, appropriate metrics for company performance are needed. The EU non-financial reporting directive is due for revision next year. There are also high chances that the EU will introduce a reporting standard for non-financial information. And I very much hope that what the EU is now doing will be concerted with existing reporting standard, and at the end of the process we will get a global reporting standard. Development work is currently underway in the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, so-called EFRAG. Let me just say a few words about so-called forest risk products. Due diligence legislation will be needed to be complemented with sectoral guidance and legislation. A Commissioner for Environment, Mr. Sinkevicius, has promised to put forward a legislative proposal in 2021. This proposal would contain measures on the supply chains of so-called ecosystem risk products. The European Parliament already put forward in September its recommendations to the Commission on elements that it expects to see in the proposal. So I'm very pleased that Commissioner Urpilainen is so committed to the sustainable cocoa multi-stakeholder dialogue, next to a few other Commission members, such as our new Trade Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis. And This is a stakeholder initiative that indeed has brought together governments, as we will be hearing again, and industries, civil society, workers, producers, of course, not only in Europe, but also in the countries where cocoa is produced. And for us, it means notably Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. So it's a wonderful example to me of what the states and the EU can do together with other stakeholders. So I hope something really meaningful will come out of this initiative. And as Commissioner Urpilainen has outlined in her speech, the actions need to be defined what are going to be undertaken. So obligations on companies are one piece of the puzzle. Let me just close by saying that, of course, we see many national initiatives on due diligence, because all the member states of the United Nations are committed to implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. It's already 10 years ago. So we have been witnessing a mushrooming of national initiatives. And what I hope to see is that we will put in place a unified framework at the EU level, so that there will be also a level playing field for companies operating in all over the EU, so that they are not anymore troubled by too many different mushrooming initiatives which aim at good but create too much confusion. So I'd like to close by saying that it's clear that in the absence of an EU-wide framework, companies will be faced with a patchwork of national requirements. So, dear Chairman and all, now it's my pleasure to move to the panel discussion that I have the honor to moderate. And let me just first say who are the participants in this panel. First, we have Abou Dosso, Ambassador, Head of the Mission to the European Union from the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. We have Harold Poelma, Chairman of European Cocoa Association. We have Aldo Cristiano, who's the President of the Caobisco. We have Justin Adams, Executive Director of the Tropical Rainforest Alliance. And indeed, this is the way we will now be continuing our discussion. And let me now invite His Excellency Ambassador Abou Dosso, whom we've already met with in different contexts, to take the floor for 5 minutes. And I hope all the speakers will respect the speaking time, 5 minutes, because then we can have an exchange. So thank you very much, and Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Vice-Présidente. Monsieur le Président de la Fondation mondiale du cacao, honorables invités, Mesdames et Messieurs, je voudrais, au nom du gouvernement ivoirien, remercier les organisateurs pour cette heureuse initiative et l'honneur qu'ils nous font en nous associant à cet important forum sur la durabilité dans la cacao-culture. Je me réjouis donc de la participation des principales parties prenantes impliquées dans la problématique de la durabilité de la production cacaoyère, notamment la Commission et le Parlement européen, les représentants des pays producteurs, la société civile, de même que les négociants et industriels du secteur du cacao. Après donc l'introduction qui vient de faire donc Madame Hautala, et après donc l'élément que nous venons de voir, c'est donc du commissaire Urpilainen, je voudrais me permettre de faire quelques observations sur la future législation européenne en matière de due diligence. C'est important, je voudrais donc en dire un mot. Le gouvernement ivoirien n'a pas de problème avec toutes les législations qui peuvent être prises pour effectivement donc envoyer plus de toutes les initiatives de promotion d'une filière cacaoyère durable. Car la question du travail des enfants et de la déforestation sont d'abord des problèmes qui sont des problèmes nationaux avant d'être des problèmes des préoccupations européennes. Donc on n'a pas de problème du tout s'agissant donc des initiatives en matière de promotion de la filière cacaoyère durable. Donc mon gouvernement, je le dis tout net, est favorable à la future législation sur la due diligence qui est demandée par les entreprises européennes. Ça, c'est clair. Mais, Madame la vice-présidente vient de nous en dire quelques mots. Il y a quand même un certain nombre de choses à préciser. La législation sur la due diligence consiste pour les entreprises à démontrer, selon notre compréhension, que leurs chaînes d'approvisionnement sont clean. Clean de tout travail des enfants, clean de toute déforestation, il n'y a pas de problème. Ça veut dire donc, pour nous, du jour au lendemain, nous savons très bien que dans notre pays, il y a encore des plantations qui sont dans des forêts classées et il y a encore des producteurs qui malheureusement continuent d'utiliser le travail des enfants. Donc, on demandera aux entreprises de montrer qu'elles sont
Okay, I'm back in the meeting now.
alors que nous savons très bien
Hear me? Yeah.
qu'une partie de la production chez nous n'est pas tout à fait clean. Donc, ma position ne pourrait pas être comprise.
I'll mute myself one sec.
Il y a quelqu'un qui parle en même temps. Donc, j'étais en train d'expliquer que... Voilà. J'étais en train d'expliquer qu'effectivement, on pourrait ne pas comprendre ma position parce que je suis d'accord pour la due diligence, mais en même temps, j'estime que les implications à très court terme peuvent être un peu difficiles à gérer. Mais donc, nous, notre compréhension, c'est que il faudrait que ce processus-là soit un processus progressif. OK? Que la nouvelle législation doit tenir compte d'un certain nombre d'éléments. Des résultats à atteindre, le temps pour atteindre ces résultats, des résultats progressifs, donc il faut des résultats intermédiaires, et il faut aussi une assistance technique et financière qui permet effectivement donc d'atteindre les résultats qu'on veut atteindre. Et c'est important. Donc oui pour la due diligence pour l'entreprise, mais en même temps, il faut se dire qu'il faut donner le temps d'y aller progressivement vers des résultats qu'on souhaite atteindre. Et c'est vraiment ça que je voulais indiquer. Et les mesures que mon gouvernement pourrait être amené à prendre sont, comme vous le savez, vont être définies dans le cadre des programmes de durabilité. Mais à chaud, on peut vous expliquer tout de suite, et je m'arrêterai là, vous dire qu'effectivement, vous doutez bien qu'il va falloir sortir des gens des forêts classées. Il va falloir donc les sortir, les reloger, les reconvertir. Et ça, c'est vraiment des programmes qui sont à mettre en œuvre rapidement. Il va falloir assister les planteurs pour qu'ils aient une production plus inclusive, une plus intensive de cacao. Il va falloir donc poursuivre la mise en œuvre de l'initiative cacao-forêt et construire des écoles, etc. Voilà donc globalement ce que je voulais dire. Tout ça pour dire qu'effectivement, il va falloir, pour que tout ça puisse être mis en place, que notre initiative sur la lead, le différentiel des revenus décents, soit sanctuarisée. Parce que la question elle est essentiellement économique. Donc, je m'arrête là pour l'instant pour cette première partie de mon intervention. Merci, madame.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And so we have heard that the Ivorian government is supportive of the EU initiative on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And what we can still discuss in this panel further is how can farmers meet the requirements. But let's first listen to 3 other people. So it's my pleasure now to invite Chairman of the European Cocoa Association, Mr. Harold Poelma, to take the floor. And I would particularly like him to explain, as the European Cocoa Association represents the major traders, processors, logistics and warehousing. So how do you see your role in this EU dialogue on sustainable cocoa? And you could also specify what would be your vision of success and what would be the key conditions to achieve it. So, Mr. Poelma, please take the floor for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Hautala. So thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. I finally got into the Zoom meeting. So thanks for the question. So the European Cocoa Association is welcoming very much the opportunity to be an active member of the multi-stakeholder dialogue. We really see our role as a convener, creating a bridge between, on the one hand, the cocoa producing countries, and on the other hand, our customers, the customers of the ECA that produce consumer products, but also to put the bridge between the producing countries and the other stakeholders in Europe. Indeed, over the years, we have established very strong partnerships with the local cocoa communities. We help them overcome the various constraints that they face, but also in parallel, we also seek to ensure that the cocoa products meet the evolving expectations from consumers in Europe. This is certainly not always an easy role, but I know we all want to see a sustainable and thriving cocoa sector where cocoa farming families prosper and human rights are respected and the environment is conserved. Now, our vision really is around 3 major components. The first one is around decent work and no child labor. We envisage a cocoa sector where children attend schools and are not participating in child labor or hazardous work. When they help their family in the family farm, their parents, the work should not be interfering with the school or other aspects of the development. And labor on the farms should be adequately compensated with no place for forced labor. The second component is around forest protection. We envision a cocoa sector where forest lands are duly protected with strong national legislation that is properly enforced, and where cocoa farmers are successfully practicing good agricultural practices and crop diversification, producing more productive crops on less land. And the third component is around living income. We envision a cocoa sector in which farming families can achieve an income that provides for adequate food, healthcare, shelter, and any unexpected events, and the education for their children. Now, that vision will need to be built on three critical building blocks to be sustainable. The first, and we believe also in all, the EU has a role to play. The first is an efficient and effective regulatory framework for the cocoa sector. The lack of an efficient and regulatory framework, and in particular the lack of an effective farmer registration system, is a major factor contributing to uncontrolled expansion of cocoa. It is of the essence of the regulatory body in the producing countries, but also to the private sector, to know where the farms are located and which farms are growing and selling cocoa. This is especially critical if farmers are to make progress on implementing more productive and sustainable practices. And it is also a key requirement if we expect progress on traceability information to the first point of sale and beyond. The effective regulatory framework will also enable a robust social protection systems that can address complex issues related to labor practices as well as well-being in the cocoa communities. The second building block is around strengthening the existing public-private partnerships and increase the EU technical and financial assistance for capacity building in origin countries. Success will require more ambitious partnerships and more extensive collaboration. We need to catalyze collective action in a shared strategy and mobilize the knowledge, innovation, and investment opportunity from all partners. And the third critical building block is around the ability for the cocoa sector to operationalize the change. We need, for instance, to support farmer entrepreneurship through access to training on business management and by facilitating access to loans. In this regard, we would encourage the EU to support risk reduction on rural finance. In parallel, we also need to professionalize cooperatives, making them more effective at registering and supporting farmers, but also at reporting and acting upon incidents linked to child labor and deforestation in the communities. We also need urgently a single national standard for sustainable cocoa, which should be in line with consuming country requirements for imported cocoa. The sector needs a solid and recognized standard covering stringent human rights and environmental protection compliance for every cocoa farmer. This standard should be achievable by farmers in a reasonable time frame with basic levels of support and training. And it should have a governance structure that benefits from the insights of government as well as from the cocoa private sector, with an auditing structure that provides trust and credibility to end consumers. I'd like to pass back the word then to you, Ms. Hautala.
Thank you very much, Harold. So we will certainly discuss the issues with Ambassador Dosso and others on the second round. So now I'd like to invite Aldo Cristiano, the president of Caobisco, to take the floor for 5 minutes also. And I would like to point out that Caobisco has stressed very much that the due diligence system will only be effective if it is coupled with framework agreements with cocoa producing countries that ensure an effective enabling environment. So I would like to ask you, Aldo, what specific policy issues do you want to see covered in these framework agreements? And do you see the multi-stakeholder cocoa platform now being a means to come to that end? So please take the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. Hautala. Bonjour also from my side. Yes, what would a due diligence system look like to be successful? What are our expectations? Let me start with some basics. A sound and workable due diligence framework will help us assess critical risk factors and interventions needed in our supply chain. In the case of Caobisco's companies, this is beyond cocoa, although cocoa is an important raw material. But once those critical risk factors are identified, and when companies have put in place the right transparency and supply chain actions, for many of the topics we are dealing with, we need to make sure that the right incentives are in place to generate a so-called systemic and long-term solution. Trade and development policies provide for the greatest opportunity to do so. Now, especially in the case of cocoa, we therefore believe that the due diligence system will be impactful if it is coupled with the wider EU strategy that creates this enabling environment required to make progress on sustainable cocoa farming within the cocoa producing countries. So therefore, as an essential complement to a due diligence system and legislation in creating impact on the ground in cocoa producing countries, the EU will need to negotiate framework agreements with the governments of the relevant cocoa producing countries and focusing on creating the right incentives to address. And let me give you 8 examples or 8 areas which we would like to see the focus. Now, first of all, law enforcement. So improving the capacity of enforcement agencies and the judicial system to enforce existing laws. On traceability, introducing a mandatory national traceability system for cocoa beans from all origins. Land and forest governance, including defining and clarifying the land and the tree tenure rights of the cocoa farmers, consistent with the international good practice and increasing participation in and the transparency of decisions over land use, cocoa production and forest protection. Number 4 is so-called land use planning and interministerial coordination, encouraging the development of national land use planning system to clarify which areas are for cocoa production and which for forest protection, and improving coordination between the agriculture and forest ministries to ensure a set of coherent aims. On deforestation, supporting the implementation of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative commitments in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and in other cocoa producing countries where relevant, in order to prevent overproduction, including ending the growing of cocoa in protected forest areas, ensuring legal protection for trees and forests outside protected areas, and encouraging the uptake of agroforestry techniques. Let me pass on child labor. Here, we need strengthening the ability of the government to protect children and improve their access to good quality education, healthcare, clean water, and better nutrition. Forced labor and trafficking. Also here, strengthening the ability of the governments to protect children and adults, including the vulnerable migrant population. And last but not least, monitoring. At the end of the day, we need system for tracking the impacts of the steps taken on those vulnerable, especially the smallholder farmers who supply most of the world's cocoa. That is what we believe should be encompassing or being added on a due diligence framework. Thank you, Ms. Hautala.
Thank you very much. I really think that it's a very comprehensive list of incentives that you have presented, and let's see how we are going to be able to put that all in place. So now we have one more important speaker. Justin Adams is the Executive Director of Tropical Forest Alliance, who has been a long-time partner to the cocoa industry, which is driven by sustainability and accountability. So Tropical Forest Alliance is talking about the need of a smart mix of measures to stop deforestation. I would like to ask Justin Adams, what needs to happen in addition to due diligence legislation, which you obviously are a supporter of? what more should companies and producing governments be doing? And do you see that the new EU multi-stakeholder platform on cocoa would be able to deliver some of those issues? So Justin, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Vice President. I want to start just by applauding the leadership of Europe on these issues at this time. I think given the COVID crisis and the critical imperative to be building back, rural economies are going to be more devastated than many, and we cannot leave anybody behind if we are truly to address the climate, biodiversity, and livelihood challenges that we know are enormous issues to face. The Tropical Forest Alliance is a group, it's a multi-stakeholder platform hosted by the World Economic Forum that brings together businesses, civil society actors, and governments to address exactly these issues. And we've been working across many commodities, forest risk commodities, for nearly a decade to look at how we can advance these very important issues. And the most important takeaway from that is that we have seen lots of really good progress where there's been individual action, and there's been a lot of pressure on companies to take action to remove deforestation from their supply chains in the last 10 years. And whilst we've seen really important progress, we know that these challenges persist, both the environmental and the social challenges. So the most important takeaway is that no individual action is going to be enough. And if we are to really make progress, we need collective action in this decade ahead. So with that in mind, we actually have convened over the last 6 months a number of roundtable discussions, originally planned to be physical, but have been virtual roundtable discussions. We've had more than 120 organizations from both business and civil society participating to really look at how the EU's proposed legislation could work around imported deforestation and how to legislate around that. And I think what's also really important is that cocoa is such a key crop for Europe. Europe is such a critical importer that in many ways the work on cocoa is more advanced. And again, I really want to applaud the leadership of many of you here today, as well as the Commission for its work to try and advance things on cocoa. But what came out of these roundtables is really the recognition that there is no such thing as a silver bullet. And whilst there is lots of focus on due diligence as the mechanism that everybody is now talking about, due diligence is only one of a suite of tools that will be needed if we are really to make progress. And I think we've heard from many of the speakers already what that is. But the conclusion from these workshops was that there was 5 actions that are really going to be needed for this, what we're calling a smart mix of measures. This is such a complex system. We need to recognize how these pieces interact together. So the first of these, at the heart of this, has to be a deeper recognition of the importance of producer country partnerships. And I think we heard a wonderful talk from Ambassador Dosso of how they are looking to this and really looking for that partnership to address some of these challenges that exist in their own country. And that's to say that the same thing is true in any of these countries. If we don't learn to develop deeper partnership, and I think there's a lot that can be learned from what is called the voluntary partnership agreements that have been in place around the European timber regulations, we have to recognize that Europe will need to invest to support capacity development, to support the enforcement of some of this, and to really address some of this. And if we're not putting partnership at the front of this, then we will not make the progress that's needed. Secondly, we need these demand side measures, of which due diligence is one critical tool, but mechanisms around sustainability and what's recognized as sustainable will also be important in the European market. The third of these is international cooperation and collaboration, and you yourself pointed this out, Vice President, of this needing to actually not end up with a mishmash of national standards, but there really being some consistency in terms of how member states are applying due diligence. And ideally, with the unfortunate situation of Brexit, that the UK is also aligning its own due diligence, which has just passed or has just been included in the Environment Bill passing through the UK government. So how can we ensure then, if we want companies to be doing their best, that there is a consistency of that regulatory approach on the demand side? The fourth which is critical. And again, an area we really believe Europe can lead on is finance. And I think there's two components to finance. There's both including provisions for how financial institutions are including a reporting requirement for where they have deforestation risk or child labor risk in their supply chains or the loans that they're providing. But importantly as well, the second component is how can we really ensure that all the rhetoric around blended finance, around carbon finance, we've been working to try and make RED, so-called REDD mechanisms work for probably 20 years. How can we finally enable that finance to move so it becomes a genuine incentive for countries like Côte d'Ivoire and other important cocoa producing countries to really have an incentive for climate smart agriculture, to actually diversify some of the crops that are grown around cocoa so we are less reliant on simply monocultures and some of the way that farming has been practiced over the last few decades. The fifth and final area of the smart mix that we're calling for is then verification. We can do all sorts of things with satellite monitoring today, but we need consistent traceability and transparency. We need a common standard for how data and intelligence is going to be used. So again, that companies can work in a consistent way to ensure that the due diligence regulations can actually be really met. And I think that means that while certification has played a critical role to get us to this point, certification and voluntary standards are not going to be enough. We need consistent traceability, transparency, so that we know where each and every bean is coming from and how and where that fits into this smart mix of measures moving forward.
Thank you very much, Justin. I think this was a perfect end to our first round with your 5 mechanisms that need to be put in place to make any due diligence mechanism meaningful. So I would like to go to our second round now. And Ambassador Dosso, you have heard from Commissioner Urpilainen, you have heard from the industry and civil society that it's very important to address key policy issues on sustainability in both producing and consuming governments. And partnership obviously is key in our discussion now. So how does Côte d'Ivoire react to all these questions that have been put to yourselves on what kind of mechanisms should be in place from your side? And do you think that our experiences of the voluntary partnership agreements that we have had for quite some time now on timber, that they could be somehow a process to develop a roadmap of commitments? So, Your Excellency, please take the floor. You have again 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Vice-Présidente. La Côte d'Ivoire, évidemment, reconnaît l'importance des questions politiques liées à la durabilité. Son adhésion à l'accord de Paris est la preuve, effectivement, donc, de cette importance. C'est aussi la raison pour laquelle nous avons accepté sans aucune hésitation de participer au dialogue multipartite de l'Union européenne sur le cacao durable, qui permet d'aborder dans un cadre politique unique toutes les approches pour une économie cacaoyère durable. La Côte d'Ivoire reconnaît aussi l'importance des questions économiques qui sont liées à la durabilité. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous pensons que l'équation est délicate, car donc mon pays doit faire coexister et le planteur et le cacao, en évitant surtout le piège de la pauvreté endémique dans les zones de production. Alors, s'agissant des accords de partenariat volontaires, la Côte d'Ivoire accueille de façon très favorable la mise en place de ces accords parce que, pour au moins 3 raisons. La première raison, c'est que les accords de partenariat volontaire proposent un cadre juridique important, tant pour l'Union européenne que pour les pays producteurs de cacao, en ce sens que les accords de partenariat volontaire garantissent l'accès de nos produits au marché européen et rassurent le consommateur européen en contrepartie d'un engagement contraignant qui sera rendu possible par la bonne coopération et le soutien aux initiatives de lutte contre la déforestation et les pires formes de travail des enfants. C'est vraiment la première raison. La seconde raison, c'est qu'en tant que premier producteur mondial de cacao, notre pays a l'opportunité d'adresser dans un cadre unique, réunissant toutes les parties prenantes, tous les aspects de durabilité dans la production du cacao, avec pour objectif ultime une filière cacao qui soit pleinement durable, qui procure des revenus décents aux producteurs et qui réduit, voire élimine les violations des droits de l'homme, notamment le travail des enfants et la dégradation de l'environnement. Troisième, enfin, cela permettra de tourner la page des initiatives. Il y a eu plein d'initiatives variées, diverses, hétérogènes, y compris les systèmes de certification, les programmes de commerce équitable, toutes ces initiatives-là qui ont montré, qui ont produit quelques résultats, mais qui n'ont pas permis de régler le problème, ça va permettre de mettre fin à tout ça et de nous donner l'opportunité d'avoir vraiment un cadre unique sur la base duquel nous pourrons travailler. Quelqu'un a dit tout à l'heure que c'est bon la certification, les due diligence, mais qu'il faudrait qu'il y ait effectivement donc des accords cadres avec les États. C'est normal, parce qu'une chose est de dire, on va simplement constater que les chaînes de cacao, d'approvisionnement, ne respectent pas toutes les normes qu'on souhaite. Une autre est de dire, il faut des programmes, un cadre, qui permettent donc d'accompagner effectivement l'évolution et de mettre en œuvre donc des programmes de durabilité. Et de ce point de vue, donc, nous accueillons favorablement et nous sommes tout à fait disposés, effectivement, avec la partie européenne, notamment sur les ressources que nous sommes mises à disposition, et environ 12 millions d'euros que l'Union européenne est en train de dégager pour la Côte d'Ivoire, qui permettront de commencer à travailler sur la mise en place d'accords de partenariat volontaires et sur la définition des programmes de durabilité qui pourront donc accompagner effectivement donc, ce processus. Voilà donc, Madame la Vice-Présidente, ce que je voulais dire par rapport à cette question. Et je me tiens à votre disposition pour d'autres questions. Merci.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ambassador. I really believe that these framework agreements that are now being discussed could be of a really novel innovation in trying to achieve our objectives. So let me now again turn to Aldo Cristiano. So my question to you would be that since the industry emphasizes the value of voluntary collective action, do you consider these voluntary actions to be successful? And how can you make sure that the whole industry and not just the few are tackling the issue effectively? So please take the floor for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you again, Ms. Hautala. Exactly, the whole industry is a key word. Barry Parkin said today in his opening speech that maybe half of the companies are on track and active. The other half is still to be taken on track. And let me again start with some basic thoughts here. Voluntary action is where it all started. And the reason we are calling today for a sound framework from a policy's perspective. In Coke, a number of chocolate companies have taken responsibility and managed to drive transparency and impact unrivaled in other supply chains. Caobisco members have since years started communicating these actions to their consumers, helping driving sustainability scheme for niche markets to mainstream. Voluntary action started with the adoption of certain standards and certification, but has grown into something wider and more far-reaching. WCF, for instance, is the home of many of these collective actions in cocoa, including relevant public-private partnerships, for example, the CFI, Cocoa Action, but also the work we did with ICI. These actions have broadly been successful and impactful. We won't be here today discussing a legal framework if we were not for our deeper involvement. But we agree it is not enough and we need to raise the bar in terms of impact and to create a level playing field, engaging and supporting other players to make their proportionate contribution. Rightly, as the governments of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire say, company programs have reached only 10% of the farmer base. This is clearly not enough, but at the same time, we think this is an outstanding achievement, considering it rests on the shoulders of a handful of pioneering companies on topics that clearly go beyond our sphere of competence. We need now to cooperate to widen this impact with a smart mix, as Justin said before, with a smart mix of voluntary and regulatory measures. And this is what we would like to see the recently launched EC, European Community Initiative on Sustainable Cocoa, in order to make the cocoa supply chain more and more sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we again hear this important notion of smart mix. I think first some people that I've talked to think that it means mainly voluntary measures, and they tend to forget that smart mix means voluntary and mandatory. And by the way, John Ruggie, the father of UN Guiding Principles, also always talks about the smart mix and likes to specify what it means. So thanks so much for this. And now let's hear again from European Cocoa Association, from Harold Poelma. I'd like really to know what commitments the industry has taken so far in terms of cocoa sustainability. And where do you see the strong cooperation of producing and consuming governments, including EU authorities, obviously, would be needed? This question of the financial and technical support, that's a key to our partnership, definitely. So, Harold, please.
Thank you for the question. So let me link back to the vision I just discussed also on the previous question, and link our commitments to that. And as you say, EU is essential in this as well, with the collaboration with the producing countries. The EU support is and its convening power, I think, will be very critical in the coming months as we do the multi-stakeholder dialogue as well, and try to come to a strong and efficient regulatory framework in both the producing countries as well as in the consuming countries. And it needs to be coupled also with EU financial support and technical support for capacity building in the producing countries. Now, on the commitments, really surrounded three topics which I already discussed. First of all, on forest protection. The industry continues to work towards the commitments made in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. And that's under the umbrella of WCF, also as Aldo Cristiano was alluded to. We do a lot of it jointly as industry. And it's focusing particularly on mapping of farms in the direct supply chains of the companies active on the ground. However, we do need support to improve farm mapping and traceability in the remaining part of the supply chain as well, where still quite a bit of sustainability challenges are prevalent. And it's very important that the existing national legislation on forest protection is also adapted to the international standards and properly enforced. Technical and financial support from the EU will be key also as we are implementing more innovations like satellite monitoring, GPS mapping, and training on forest protection, which are costly and difficult to cover by the origin governments or the industry alone. One of the major challenges that we see today is the potential relocation of families that are currently living in protected forest areas. This may involve thousands of families and must be undertaken with care and with respect of the rights of each affected person. Now let me go to the second area that we have commitments on and interventions, which is on decent work and child labor. Education is the key for escaping the poverty trap. So all children must have access to free and quality education. We will keep on working closely also with the International Cocoa Initiative on implementing child labor monitoring and remediation systems to eradicate child labor from the cocoa supply chain. And we have made commitments as an industry on implementing CLMRS. It is, however, very important that the producing country governments, with support of the EU, must ensure that schools are being built, teachers are being trained and supported, and that adequate transport and other services are made available, basically, to have access to schools easier. Just as an example, in some countries, children are unable to enroll into schools as they lack the birth certificates. And girls in particular are in various precarious situations. Then let me go to the third area, which is on living income. The industry will continue its efforts in ensuring that farming families are able to achieve a living income for cocoa households. Efforts to increase income must be coupled with the establishment of a stronger regulatory framework, as mentioned earlier. Without such a system, it can be expected that increased income will drive further expansion of cocoa farming and increase the risk of continued negative consequences. In this regard, having a framework that effectively limits the expansion of cocoa farming must become a very serious consideration in the near future. On these important matters, we would welcome EU support in addressing the root cause of poverty which are often linked to the lack of capacity and basic services. Only by taking a holistic approach to household income, we will be able to ensure that all cocoa farmers earn a decent income to their families, and also that cocoa remains an attractive crop for generations to come. In conclusion, what we expect in the end from the multi-stakeholder dialogue in Europe on sustainable cocoa is that the EU will propose a very clear action plan for the cocoa sector at large, outlining provisions for technical and financial assistance at producing country level. On the new EU legislative framework on mandatory due diligence, we'd like to draw the attention also to the development of different national cocoa sustainability platforms in the EU and Switzerland. We do call upon the EU to monitor and coordinate with these platforms to ensure that proliferation of different initiatives does not cause unintended negative consequences on cocoa farmer communities, and therefore hampering progress achieved so far. And as a closing point, in addition to the EU action plan, companies should be provided guidance by the EU on implementing the upcoming due diligence legislation, while origin governments should ensure that developments such as the African Regional Standard for Sustainable Cocoa comply with the EU requirements for sustainable produced cocoa. Thank you.
Thanks. I think to discuss the standard for sustainability, what is sustainable cocoa, would be one of the key issues in the platform. So now I'd like to turn finally to Justin Adams to ask how to engage other partners. You said that the EU is now a leader, and we of course should be wary of any complacency, because we are just beginning, but I think we are solidly beginning the roadmap towards mandatory human rights due diligence and sustainable cocoa, the partnerships. But there are countries like China, who is always a challenge to us, because they are really a huge economic and market power, but very little attention, to my knowledge at the moment, to this kind of sustainability issues. I hope I'm very wrong, but so what to do with other emerging economies that account for quite a growing share of imports of forest or ecosystem risk products? So Justin, how would you answer to this question?
Thank you. I might just say one thing on the smart mix. So again, just to reinforce this, the smart mix is indeed a balance between regulatory and voluntary. And it's not simply just regulatory, but it's actually how do you bring all the different parts of government together, all the different parts of the Commission, so DevCo and environment, and how we're going to deploy finance more broadly with banks like EIB and things. So how do we bring all of the different parts together to actually enable the outcomes that we're targeting? That's what a smart mix has to look like for a complex challenge such as we're talking about. In terms of engaging other countries, I think a couple of things to say. I mean, Europe is obviously looking at cocoa, but it's also looking at all the forest risk commodities and soybeans and palm oil. Cocoa becomes particularly important for Europe because as fast as other economies are growing, Europe still accounts for 60% plus of cocoa imports. Okay, so in terms of cocoa, Europe really is in such a responsible position to bring its leadership to bear and to be thinking how does it move these different the environmental and the social agendas forward with the producer countries. China and Asia Pacific more broadly is only about 18% of cocoa imports, and obviously these markets are shifting, but Europe remains a critical player for cocoa. In other commodities, those roles are actually reversed, where Europe is a much smaller importer for, say, soybeans compared to Brazil. But a country like China is starting to engage in these issues in I think some promising ways, but ways that we need to be very thoughtful about how we engage. And indeed, there is some very promising multi-stakeholder discussions with the Chinese government and other Chinese actors about how important this issue is for them to engage. They are generally much further back on the sustainability journey. This has not been something that has been the front of their mind in terms of their international footprint. But actually, there's a lot of things that China is doing domestically, which also can be ways that they can then bring their knowledge to other countries. So China has an extraordinary land use planning mechanism that they call ecological redlining, where they really designate areas that are for production and areas that are for environmental protection, areas that are for urban, areas that are for rural. So, and bringing that type of, and I'd say China's probably the only country going into the climate and biodiversity conferences that we will have next year that can bring a spatially explicit map of how it's going to meet its biodiversity and climate goals. So if we can create bridges to how China's leading on that domestic agenda, and indeed how China is starting to take leadership on the climate agenda. So Europe has set a 2050 target for net zero. You know, the biggest news from Climate Week this year and the UN General Assembly was President Xi committing to 2060 climate neutrality for China, which is unthinkable in terms of the discussion and the dynamics of the climate politics. So how do we, and they can't achieve that unless they understand their importing footprint as well. Because actually, as soon as they understand their importing footprint and the challenge of land use change to supply China with the commodities it needs for its growth, China can't meet that target. So in conclusion, there are some promising developments in China that we can link to and think about how China can engage and bring its own expertise to this agenda that Europe might learn from as well. So that's one dimension. And then, but really building the case for how and where China might act to achieve its long-term goals. China and Asian economies more broadly, Asian culture more broadly, takes a longer-term view than many Western economies. And I think that gives us, that's one of the things that we could be helpful about. And the EU-China relationship is, to my mind, one of the most critical relationships that we have in terms of how we are going to work together to address so many of these challenges that I touched on earlier.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this statement also concerning China. I think we were all quite stunned to hear this commitment of President Xi to the carbon neutrality objective of 2060, which is really not so far from what some others have done. A little better, but so I think we will have a great potential also to talk to the new US administration on yeah, and obviously I think we have to wrap up now, and I would like to say that this issue of sustainability is really has a lot to do with land use and land mapping, registration of farmers, which we have heard. And was also mentioned in due time that the capacity of the hosting governments needs to be strengthened, and that's why I think it's extremely important that we have the toolbox of EU development cooperation now directed to these partnerships. And I also take note of the fact that the cooperation between different sectors, also in government, also in the EU Commission, is really key. And I must say that I haven't seen this kind of willingness to cooperate across sectors, from trade to environment to development before. And I mean, how else could we reach any results on sustainability if we don't come away from our silos? So that's certainly something really important. And the question of the living wage is really key here, because our ultimate aim is also to eradicate poverty and to address the root causes of poverty. And there, I think the cooperation between the governments of Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana on one hand, and on the EU on the other, are really important. So I think all these issues will be deepened in this multi-stakeholder platform. And I also thank for this notion from Harold Poelma that there are different platforms. I said that there are different national initiatives on due diligence, but there are obviously also different ideas, different initiatives on platforms, and then they need to be coordinated. And I think it will be really possible to seek a cooperation between the EU, Switzerland, and other partners. So I'm very happy to conclude this panel with great expectations that the multi-stakeholder COCO platform will get us to a new kind of partnership, which brings also the EU toolbox together in the aim of sustainable cocoa and livelihoods of cocoa farmers in West Africa, to get children away from work in the cocoa fields and to school. So thank you very much for everyone for participating in this important discussion. Ambassador Abou Dosso, Chairman Harold Poelma, President Aldo Cristiano, Executive Director Justin Adams. So I will now close this session. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, both to Barry and to Heidi for those very scintillating, stimulating remarks, and also, of course, to the panelists who were bringing a very diverse set of views and then have really reflected a lot of interesting points today. Coming up, here are the panelists who will be gracing us in the What's Next for the Dialogue on Living Income session. It's a great group of people, right? Okay, so we'll see you there after this short break. Thank you.